This question came via the form that I showed you today. The question is here all about multi-tenant data vault environments, where you have multiple tenants inside the organization and you want to have a enterprise-wide data vault model across all the tenants essentially, right? So let me just read this. So I'm struggling with link management evolution process in multi-tenant warehouse and putting all data together in the information mart. Our data warehouse contains internal data as well as shared data from our clients, for which our company performs job requisition processes using their own internal systems. We receive data from these systems. In the next 2 to 3 years, we will onboard 50 to 60 clients to our warehouse. Currently, we're in the MVP phase. Data was developed only for a few clients. How should I manage my links with that many various systems, such big number of source tables and same yet slightly different processes? It's also important that the goal is to have one common information mart design, the dimension model, for our clients to enable similar, same reporting capabilities. So let's think about this. We'll focus on, in the first part of this question, I would like to focus on the raw data vault and business vault, and then we discuss the information mart design essentially. For the raw data vault, for satellites, we typically define that a satellite is only being sourced from one source system. That's number one. Well, that's true for most environments, except for multi-tenant systems, where we might have similar structures for your clients. Let's say all of them are using Salesforce or SAP or whatever. They have source systems with similar structures. As long as you can partition your data by a key inside your parent, inside a hub or link, and as long as the structure is the same, we can use the same target satellite to load multiple tenants into, or multiple source systems into the same satellite. And multi-tenancy is part of that. As long as you have a partition key, that's your tenant ID inside your hub or link structure, and as long as the structure is the same. Well, if your clients, if your tenants can customize the local installation of their Salesforce instance, well, so they still have a common structure. This common structure we can capture in one satellite only, and then create additional satellites for those customizations that everybody made for themselves, right? So that's number one. We can simplify the satellites here by loading multiple tenants into the same satellite, as long as the parent, the hub or the link, contains some tenant ID. Because then, let's say you have a local customer ID. The local customer ID is per tenant. So there could be multiple customers 42 in each tenant, and 42 identifies a different customer in each tenant, right? But once you extend the local business key by the tenant ID, that combination is your unique business key across your enterprise. And just by having this tenant ID inside your hub or inside your link, you essentially, it leads to the fact that satellites will describe with their deltas business keys of a certain tenant only. They're not overriding the descriptions of one client with another client in another tenant essentially, right? So every satellite will have partitions of deltas or subsets of deltas describing different tenants essentially. That's the cool thing about that. And that leads us to the next idea. What about adding a tenant ID just everywhere? Not just to the hubs, where it makes sense because that extends your business key, and that's actually a standard practice. If you have multiple source systems and the business key is not unique across these source systems, we're extending it by some source identifier, business key collision code, or whatever. Maybe a tenant ID, right? So we're adding this to the hubs, that's clear, because of the satellites. We also set links as well, because when you add them to the links, you have the same idea with the satellites, creating subsets of deltas for each tenant. And yeah, so why don't we just add a tenant ID, at least on the hubs and the links, as a reference code, right? Just add that to the hub and link structures, and maybe also to the satellites, because also it's convenient if you always know the tenant of your data in all the hubs, the links, the satellites, maybe just everywhere, right? So in the whole raw data vault, in the business vault, we just add a tenant ID to all the entities, and that's the tenant ID becomes part of the ultimate key. In your hub, it's part of the business key. In the link, it's part of the hub references. Is it true? Yeah, right. It must be, because then you have the a unique hash key. The tenant ID becomes part of the hub references, and it leads to a unique hash key. And in satellites, if the hash key is already per tenant because you calculated tenant ID into the hash key computation, the satellite contains the tenant ID as another payload field, essentially. It's not part of the primary key, but it's part of the payload, essentially. That's the idea. And then you can always know what tenant this record belongs to. So you can essentially query for some certain tenant and so on. That's the idea. The question is, what's the tenant ID? What's the tenant definition? And that you might ask your business side. I'm not sure you roll this here as well. It's all in your case. I have some side information from the rest of the email here. That's the tenant. It's all about ownership. So some of the data might be owned by headquarters, but not even the data from the tenants. But then there's also data which is owned by tenants and not by headquarters, that kind of stuff. So the in this case, the ownership defines a tenant. That would so if you own some tenant data, that's a different tenant, in my opinion, from a separation basis, because it was also part of your discussion that I had with you, how to separate the data sets here for security purposes. You might want to think about in your specific case, about a tenant ID that reflects your ownership and the tenant organization. While in more simple cases, you have stuff like the SAP business unit, for example, or in Salesforce as well, some business unit that you could use as a tenant ID. Or in some other cases, you use the country, for example. If your business is organized by countries, every country has its own legal entity, for example, then they often use a country ID to distinguish those tenants. In other cases, in production, it's often driven by the plants, by the factories. So the factory identifier might be your tenant. Ask your business really how they organize how they distinguish the tenants from each other, essentially. That should drive your tenant ID definition. And in your specific case, you also want to think about the ownership, because once the tenant ID is inside your all your entities, you said in part of your email that for security reasons or to implement access control, role level security, you would join a satellite. You don't need it anymore. Once you have the tenant ID inside all the entities, you can easily secure the data, because you know this record belongs to a certain tenant. Is the user querying your data? Does it belong to the tenant as well? Great, give access, otherwise not. So it's easy to implement security once the tenant ID is inside your entities. So that, and we keep doing this for the whole raw data vault, for the business vault. Always add a tenant ID. Now there's some challenges sometimes regarding your source systems. Sometimes it's clear this source system is, in your case, when you said you're onboarding 60 clients with their own systems, you can assign a source system to a tenant. So what we're doing is we're adding the tenant ID typically already in the staging process often. So to the staging area, we add a column to all your stage data from a certain source system and add a tenant ID as a constant value. That's actually in the book, in the Building a Scalable Data Warehouse book. There is an example where we add constant values to the staging process, I believe. I'm relatively sure. I know it's in there. I believe we do it in the staging process already for some source systems. We add some ID for that. I believe actually in a tenant section or in some discussion of that. So you add the tenant ID essentially because you assign the source system to a tenant, and then we're adding a field. That's not a soft rule, by the way, because we're not adding any conditional logic. If this record is green, then assign it to tenant 1. If it's red, assign it to tenant B or something, right? No, we don't do that. We add a constant value. And we do this all the time, for example, with the system attributes, right? With hash keys and so on, where we even calculate something. But like a record source is also a good example. It's just a constant value we add often. So adding a constant value where all the records that you stage get the same exact constant value, that's the hard rule, actually. So then we can, because there's no computation involved, essentially, no conditional logic and so on. Now, so that's what we add for those systems you can assign to a tenant. Sometimes you have source systems where the tenant ID is part of the source system, like SAP, for example. In this case, you can just capture data, and then when designing your hosting satellites, you use the field from the source system to define your tenant, because you're dealing with multiple tenants in one source system. And then you have cases where the source system is global. It's not assigned to a specific tenant, but you need the data for all the tenants. Or it's a mess, and everybody is writing in there and using it, but nobody knows who this owns, essentially. So be it. From a data-driven perspective, this tenant, you could argue, is getting no tenant ID, or this hub and link or whatever is not getting any tenant ID. What I would do is I would reserve some tenant ID code for the global data, having a global tenant ID, not even headquarters, because headquarters is just another business unit. maybe some global identifier for data that does not belong not to headquarters, not to anybody, but to that you use everywhere, essentially, right? Or it's not clear who owns the data sometimes. Could also be the case, especially for role level security. You might also have that case, unclear case. Could be helpful for your role level security if you decide not to share this type of data. Where it's unclear, you can't share. That's your security concern. While global data you can share, right? So that could be a definition. Up to you, right? So you have some specific code for global data, maybe unclear data, and add that as tenant IDs essentially to your records. And then that's the easy part for the role vault, for the business vault. Modeling wise, again, if you have the same business keys, create one hub. A hub identifies business objects on the same granularity and the same semantic meaning. So if all the tenants talking about the same business objects here, customers, products, and so on, fine, one hub. And I'm a big fan of creating on a relation database at least a hub per structure. So if the business keys are completely different, I might tend to create different hubs essentially. Also longer story. And then for the satellites, as I said, if you have the same structures because they're using the same source systems, it's easy. Try to minimize the number of satellites by adding you already added the tenant ID to the satellite structure, and then just keep loading all the data into the same satellite from all the different tenants from different source systems, as long as the structure is the same. And for those customizations where they deviate from the standard structure, you could then add additional satellites per tenant or per structure. Now, if they have different source systems, if one tenant is using SAP, the other one is using Salesforce, and the next one is using, I don't know, well, so be it. Then you have different structures. We create different satellites for that. Lots of satellites potentially, because dealing with lots of source systems, different source systems. So you get wide PRT tables, so be it. And that's the standard design. And then for the information marts, well, you have to come up how you want to provide this information to the end user and how you combine data from Salesforce and SAP into one dimension. That's all business logic restructuring. But as soon as you have the satellites attached to the PRT, table index, I can then essentially query data, coalescing it out, if statements that combine the data from different source systems into one perspective on the same customer essentially. And also don't forget the same as links, because if the same customer is in different source systems in different tenants, but maybe using different business keys, different customer numbers, the same as link will resolve this, right? So you have to have either some raw data that gives you some mapping, how these products getting mapped, how the users getting mapped, the customers getting mapped, and so on, or calculate this using fuzzy matching and some other options. So this, or Soundex and so on. So there must be some business rule or some raw data that gives you the input for the SAMS link. And then the SAMS link is either in a raw data vault, if it's based on raw data, some mapping tables, or if it's calculated by you, then it's part of the business vault essentially. That's the idea. And that's the input for the dimensions. And again, for the dimensions, you might want to deduplicate the records across different tenants. Well, let me rephrase this. If your goal is to build information mart, and that's enterprise-wide across all your tenants, where you can mix and match all the data, fine, we can do that. So we can apply the same as link with the PRT table, join hub data, join all the satellites, use if statements or coalesce statements to reduce it to a common perspective on the same customer. I believe that you also wrote, maybe not here, that you might need some information marts for specific tenants. So one tenant in Germany gets only their data and headquarters maybe, or some global data. That's what they can combine. And then the British client, the British tenant gets only the British data and their data and so on. I'm not sure if you can merge all data for the headquarters perspective, but that's what I just explained. That's the enterprise-wide view where you combine everything. For the local perspectives, what I would do is, instead of creating one information mart per tenant, well, you could do that if they have a specific information need. Okay, fine, we can do that. But typically when you have let's say a information mart which is to be used by every tenant, but they only should see their own data, that's relatively easy. We added the tenant ID to all your entities, so it's also in the pit table. And you don't need it in the pit table. You could add it as well. So the row is assigned to a tenant, would work. So you can essentially also add the tenant ID to the dimension and then filter for it. You have some role security on the PID tables and on the other entities, and that reduces the records to the German records, to the British records, and so on. So you use one information mark, but role security reduces the number of records I can see from Germany, for example. I can only see the German customer records, and so on. So that's the best design, I would say, to reduce the effort on one hand, but also have the full flexibility. And then you can switch users, connect with a different user in the information mart, get different records because these are sitting in France, in Poland, and so on, right? So they have different perspectives on the same information, more or less, a reduced perspective based on the access control list that you defined for the role level security. That's the basic idea. That's how I would design it, and that's how we design it actually for customers, right? Yeah, if you have a question like this, don't hesitate. I'm starting to run short on questions, so if you have anything, you just shoot them right here, right? Using this form here, sfr.de/Friday. That's where you can submit your questions, essentially. You can also, if you're watching this on YouTube, comment on YouTube. That's fine as well. So we try to pick up questions from there as well. And there is the Data Dreamland 2025 coming up in very short time now. It's in November already, November 26th, in Hanover. Thanks for joining, and yeah, have a nice weekend. Hope to see you next Friday, guys. Thank you, guys.